Para dar inicio al diálogo sobre temas estratégicos de la relación de América del Norte, cedo la palabra al doctor Jaime José Serrapuche, fundador y presidente de SAI Derecho y Economía.
Buenos días, estamos poniéndonos de acuerdo aquí, vamos a llevar la reunión en cortesía a la ministra Freeland en inglés. Entonces, aquellos que quieran pedir su traducción, por favor, prepárense. I'm advising them to get their translating. We have organized a meeting, which is, I think, a very relevant meeting after this wonderful speech given by Minister Guajardo about the strategy and the economics of NAFTA, which I think are set up very clear guidelines for the negotiation, and this from Mexico, the Mexican standpoint. And now we're going to talk to the ministers of foreign affairs, and there are several issues that I think are interconnected naturally with the NAFTA negotiations, and also things that we deal with in bilateral terms and also in trilateral terms. So the rule of the game will be that the Minister Freeland will speak for 10 minutes, then Minister Videgaray will speak for 10 or whatever minutes they want, and then we'll enter into a dialogue and Q&A. So, Minister, welcome to Mexico. It's wonderful to have you here, and we're all looking forward to listening to your points.
Buenos días, muchas gracias. C'est un très grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici avec vous ce matin. Comme vous tous savez, le Mexique est un partenaire très important pour le Canada, et surtout maintenant, comme Ildefonso a dit, c'est une période du travail mutuel très, très étroite. Now I'll go to English. So it's a huge pleasure for me to be here today. It's great to be here with Luis and with Ildefonso, two incredibly important partners for me and for Canada. I'll just make a few remarks about Canada and trade and NAFTA, Canada and Mexico, and Canada and the United States. On trade, I think it's important for me to be very clear with everyone here, our Mexican colleagues, but also our American colleagues who are here, that Canada is a trading nation. Our government believes strongly in the value of trade for our economy. We believe that trade creates great, good-paying middle-class jobs. And although it may not be very fashionable today to talk about trade this way, we really see trade as win-win. There are only 36 million Canadians. We have a big country, but not that many people. And the only way for Canadians to be prosperous is by being energetically engaged in the global economy. We really believe that, and I think we have the support of our country. I listened with great interest to Ildefonso's description of Mexico's focus today on trade diversification. And I certainly strongly salute that. That is very much where Canada is going as well. As Ildefonso mentioned, I was trade minister until a few months ago, and probably the thing that I was the most proud of in that portfolio was that we were able to conclude CETA, our trading agreement with Europe. That's a really big deal. We were very, very pleased to diversify our relationship that way. We're aware that Mexico is updating your trading agreement with the EU, and I think that actually is another area of partnership between Canada and Mexico, our relationship with Europe. And also, as Ildefonso said, we're very focused on the Asia-Pacific. Canada is very proud of our special relationship with the Pacific Alliance, and we're exploring very energetically deepening our trade relationships across Latin America and in the Asia-Pacific. On NAFTA, it's striking for me, Ildefonso and I had breakfast together this morning with some of your business leaders here, and I think it was striking how similar our views are. So when it comes to NAFTA, I also want to be very clear, from the Canadian perspective, this is a really successful trade agreement. I think it is probably the most successful trade agreement in the world. It's an agreement that has brought a lot of jobs and prosperity to Canadians and across the North American continent. That is not just my view, that is a view of Canadians. Recent opinion polls show that NAFTA has the support of the overwhelming majority of Canadians. And I think especially today, it's important to remind people and to remind ourselves of this. This is a really good trading agreement that has really worked and has done terrific things for Canadian workers. I think it has done terrific things for workers across our continent, and it has brought our continent together and helped to create not only prosperity but security for all North Americans. Having said that, we also, Canada, very much welcomes an opportunity to modernize NAFTA. Modernizing trade agreements is routine. It is good practice. Currently, our trade officials are engaged in modernizing a number of our trade agreements. Our trade agreement with Chile, our trade agreement with Israel, our trade agreement with the EFTA countries. It's very normal. By our count, NAFTA itself has been significantly modernized already 11 times. And this is certainly a great opportunity to bring it in line with the 21st century economy and the realities of those economy. So we are ready to go. I was going to say we're rolling up our sleeves, but I have no sleeves today. But you will accept the metaphor, I think. On our relationship with Mexico, what Canadians will be aware of, Mexicans perhaps less so, is that our government, we were elected in the fall of 2015, and during the election campaign, one of our campaign platforms and one of our commitments was to work hard at improving Canada's relationship with Mexico. We felt, even in opposition, that this was an essential relationship with Canada. There are, after all, only 3 countries on our continent, and we are 2 of them. And we really wanted to make it a priority to focus on strengthening those ties. We were delighted to host President Peña Nieto and the Mexican team last summer for a bilateral state visit to Canada. And I must say, given subsequent political developments, I am so pleased that we did our homework, both Canada and Mexico, and did the work to build up our political relationship. I think it's serving us in very good stead. I also wanted to say, and it's been working, our bilateral relationship, I think, extremely well. We were pleased to lift the visa requirement, and thank you very much, Mexicans. You've been visiting Canada a lot more now that it's easier. Mexican tourists, more Mexican tourists are coming to Canada. You should do that. This is our 150th anniversary as a country, so it's a fun time to visit. And it's actually warm now. The next few months are a great time to come, and even when it's cold, you can come and go skiing. And we were very grateful that we were able to also do some real work on improving the bilateral trading relationship between Canada and Mexico, particularly on the beef issue, for which Ildefonso, muchas gracias. That was very important for us. On the NAFTA negotiations, I want to be very clear that the Canadian position is that this is a trilateral agreement, and so I think it's simply common sense that any negotiation needs to be a trilateral negotiation as well. And I think that that is going to be a very effective mechanism for Canada, for Mexico, and for the United States. And then finally, I just wanted to make a few comments about the United States and our approach. We have focused a great deal since the U.S. election on outreach to the United States. I think that Mexicans share with Canadians a familiarity with the fact that we know a lot about the United States. It's kind of our job as Mexicans and Canadians to be specialists in the U.S. We actually found during the U.S. election campaign that Canadians were more aware of U.S. political issues than Canadian ones. That's how focused the Canadian public was. So that's sort of our job. we're smaller. Americans are not always that focused on us and are not always that aware of their relationship with us. And so we as a government have felt that it's been very important for us to have a very strong outreach campaign to talk to Americans about the value of the Canada-US economic relationship and about the value of NAFTA. I just wrote down a couple of numbers to give you a sense of what we've been doing. Since the inauguration, we've had 235 meetings between Canadian government officials and U.S. We've had 110 visits. We've met with those have included meetings with the President and 13 cabinet secretaries. We've had meetings with 115 members of Congress and with 35 governors or lieutenant governors. So if you're an American official or legislator, it's been hard to avoid a Canadian. Everywhere they turn, we try to be there. And the point that we've really been making is that the Canada-US economic relationship and the NAFTA relationship has been balanced and mutually beneficial. We have a lot of numbers to back that up. We've broken it down to specific congressional districts. When I met Paul Ryan, I told him that his district did $1 billion of trade with Canada, and he was shocked. He said, "Just mine? $1 billion of exports?" I said, "Yes, Speaker, that's right." So that's an important message, and I do really want to salute and thank all of the Mexicans here, because I know that Mexico has been engaged in a similar, very energetic, and from my perspective, very effective outreach effort. And I think, the fact that both of our countries are doing it is really fantastic. And, in closing, I really want to make an appeal to the Americans who are here, because I know there's a strong U.S. presence too. I think this is probably a self-selecting U.S. audience. The Americans who show up at events like this are probably people who are pretty convinced of the benefits of trade and the benefits of NAFTA. And my appeal to you is exactly as Ildefonso said. We're going to work hard on advocacy. We're focused on it, and I think both Canada and Mexico are doing a pretty good job. But at the end of the day, we're not Americans. You are. And if you believe in the power and the benefits of this trading relationship, please help us. And please be clear with your own legislators, with your own officials. That really is an essential voice as we move into the active stage of these negotiations. Okay, I think that's all I want to say. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Minister Freeland. Very clear speech, wonderful topics. And now we'll hear from Minister Videgaray.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for all for being here. Thank you to the Council of the Americas. Thank you, Susan, for putting this together. But most importantly, thank you, Chrystia. Thank you not only for being here at this event, this very important event, but thank you for being in Mexico. It says a lot that you are here, and we are honored and we are delighted by your presence. And we look forward to a good day of work with you and your team. Before I start, I want to say something that to me is very important. I want to acknowledge and thank Jaime Serra, not only for being the moderator of this panel, but in a day where NAFTA suddenly became the centerpiece of public discussion in Mexico, where one of the main concerns is how do we protect a treaty that's been good for North America as a whole and certainly very good for NAFTA. We should acknowledge and recognize and applaud the work of the man who made it possible. Jaime, as a Mexican, thank you very much to you. And to all your team back then. including a very distinguished member of your team sitting there, who's our current Secretary of the Economy, Ildefonso Guajardo. We are ready for an NAFTA negotiation because we have great negotiators who understand the matter, who know the process, who are diligent and prepared. So we're ready to go as soon as our counterparts are ready to go, and we know that Canada certainly is ready to go. Chrystia started her comments by saying Canada is a nation that believes in trade. Certainly Mexico is a nation that believes in trade. We believe in trade as good public policy to further opportunity, to create value, and NAFTA has been a prime example of the kind of value, jobs, and opportunities that can be created through trade in all three nations. Certainly, as always, in trade, as it happens in free markets within an economy, there are winners and losers. But overall, the process is about creating value. And today, certainly, a country that has free trade agreements with 46 nations has proven that trade is a successful tool for development. Can it be made better? For sure. And that's our work. But as a principle, let's make it very clear that we believe in trade, just as Canada does. And that's a framework. And that's our basic parameter that will guide our talks when they start on NAFTA. We not only believe in trade, but we believe in North America as an idea, as a concept, and most of all, as an opportunity. North America has all the resources, all the potential to be the most competitive region in the world. We just need to seize that opportunity that in many ways has been created already by those who have been in government before us, and most importantly, by societies, by the private sector. A lot of the integration in North America happens regardless of what people in Washington, Ottawa, or Mexico cities think. This is a market-driven process, and a very efficient one. Our role is to facilitate that, to promote that. And we strongly believe in that idea, which is not only an idea, it's an ideal. And we will pursue that. I should say that we strongly believe in our relationship with Canada. We are friends and we're strategic partners. Canada has been very clear. Prime Minister Trudeau, Chrystia, they always, I've heard them more than a few times reacting to the America First statement. Chrystia is very quick at saying, yeah, Canada first for the Canadians, just as Mexico goes first for Mexicans. But that doesn't mean that we cannot further our own interest by having strong ties and a true partnership with our friends and neighbors. We believe in this friendship, we believe in this alliance as a way to promote the interest of Mexico. And we are very excited about going into this new chapter in the history of North America, in the building of this ideal alongside Canada. It doesn't mean that we want to agree on everything, but on the fundamentals, we already know that we agree. And the driving principles of our work are always the same. And I should say that we also believe really strongly in our friendship, in our partnership, in our relationship with the United States of America. This is perhaps the thing that has been forgotten the most in this very public and very confrontational political environment, that we are partners. We're not only neighbors, we're partners. And the relationship between Mexico and the US is a relationship, quite frankly, stronger than whatever the governments on both sides decide. We want it to be a balanced relationship. which, by the way, is not only about trade. It's perhaps one of the most complex, richest relationships around the world. It's about migration, it's about security, it's about culture, education, it's about tourism, it's about many things that bring us together. And while we might have some very clear, very public differences with the current administration, we will continue to pursue our closeness with the administration and with the United States as a whole. Just as Canada, we've engaged in countless, by the way, we don't count how many, you do, but that'd be a good practice. We should start counting how many.
I have a spreadsheet in my office, Luis.
How many meetings we have. But the other day in Spain, the Minister of Foreign Relations very kindly said, Luis is probably the foreign minister I've met the most over the past 3 months. Well, that's not the case. I couldn't correspond to that very kind gesture because the foreign minister I met the most is Rex Tillerson from the US. And it's been the case for Ildefonso, it's been the case for José Antonio Meade with their counterparts. And obviously, our team in Washington has been extremely busy meeting with people. Why? Because we believe in the relationship. There's always a temptation just to turn our backs away and say, okay, we have this environment. Let's move on. Let's look somewhere else. No, we're not doing that. We want to engage, and we want to build a strong relationship with the new administration. And we've learned a lot, and hopefully they've learned also some things about us, about the things that we are willing to do, and about the things that we will never, ever do. And as we do that, we understand that this has got to be a relationship that is truly balanced. It's not only about having a good trade deal, but it's also to have a different and better strategy to go against our common problems, like organized crime and illegal drugs, where we should stop playing the blame game, and as Secretary Kelly and Secretary Tillerson did last week, acknowledge that we have a real shared responsibility. And when we talk about migration and we talk about security, overall, this is a shared responsibility framework. And we're looking to a relationship that acknowledges reality and that in the end is good, certainly for the US and of course for Mexico. As Ildefonso said at the end of his talk, this is going to be an interesting ride. Don't expect it to be linear. It's going to be colorful. There are going to be days that are going to be really good, and there are going to be days that are going to be not so good. There's going to be some stress. But we are firmly convinced that we can get to a good outcome. Most of all, because we understand what our principles are, what our objectives and our limits are. And most importantly, because that's in the best interest of Canada, the US, and of course Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Videgaray. Excellent presentation as well. We should start the dialogue. But I want to take the opportunity to say a little joke. When we started the negotiations for the trilateral, for NAFTA, then Minister John, I forgot his name, but not Michael Wilson, but Crosby, Newfoundlander, said back in the days when President Bush 41 was president and Carla Hills was the trade negotiator in the USTR, he said, the only thing between Mexico and Canada is lots of Bush and Hills. And I thought it was a very smart way of putting things, but that helped tremendously to break the ice for the negotiations. And the process of integration that this region has achieved after 20 plus years is so intense, as it has been explained by Minister Guajardo and by yourselves, that we are on the same side of the table now. When we negotiated NAFTA, we were in three sides of a triangular table, but right now we're on the same side of the table. If we introduce any protectionist elements within the region, we will all be hurting ourselves in our competitiveness vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Now, having said that, I'm wondering if we could elaborate a little bit on the trilateral issue just for a moment, because it's clear now that both Mexico and Canada are very much in favor of trilateral negotiations, but I still see in the US some doubts about this. And instead of saying what are the natural things why the negotiation should be trilateral, I'm wondering if you could, the two of you could elaborate on what is the good thing that comes with bilaterals? What would be the right or the positive elements if we were to have the three bilaterals rather than one trilateral? I myself don't find it, but probably you guys that are much more intelligent and much more involved in the process, you might be able to tell us something about that.
Okay, well, thank you. And when you were working with Minister Crosby, was he wearing sealskin? Yes. All Canadian politicians from Newfoundland and Labrador are obliged to wear, not legally, but politically, to wear something which has sealskin. It's an important industry there. NAFTA is a trilateral agreement. And that has worked because it's a trilateral North American trading relationship. So Canada feels, and we don't even really feel this is a contentious issue, it's just a matter of common sense. NAFTA can be modernized only with the agreement of the three parties, and it makes sense for us that the negotiations should be with the three parties. And I am confident that that will be how we go. Now, of course, we all have bilateral issues in trade. I referred earlier to the Canada-Mexico beef issue, which we were able to resolve. That was, we're NAFTA partners, but we had a bilateral discussion about beef. We have bilateral issues with the United States. I think people at this point, I feel like the whole world is familiar with softwood lumber. Ildefonso has a bilateral discussion which is ongoing on sugar. So of course there are specific bilateral issues that aren't necessarily even really a big part of NAFTA, but are bilateral economic relationships. But I want to be really clear that I think there actually can't be much of a debate that when you have a trilateral agreement, you need to have a trilateral negotiation. And I do want to make one other point, Jaime, because you've raised this question of, is bilateral better? Ildefonso referred to some WTO issues, and, Canada believes very strongly in the global trading order and in the multilateral institutions which govern that trading order. We believe that a rules-based international order for trade and also for international relations is one of the great accomplishments of the post-World War II world. We are proud of the role that Canada played in setting up those institutions. We appreciate, the WTO is far from perfect, and Ildefonso and I have spent many exhausting hours in negotiating rounds. But it is a really fantastic accomplishment for the world that these multilateral institutions exist. And they are perhaps particularly important for middle-sized countries like Canada and Mexico. A world without a multilateral rules-based order and multilateral institutions that governs that order is a world where might makes right, and a world that can easily devolve into a sort of smoot, holly, protectionist downward spiral. So what I will say is, NAFTA we see as a trilateral negotiation, but even more than that, we think that now is a very important time to stand up for the international rules-based multilateral order?
Well, we've made it very clear, just as Chrystia is saying, NAFTA is a trilateral agreement and it should be a trilateral conversation. That's the way it is. And that's what makes sense. And doing anything else would be, quite frankly, a lost opportunity. Why? Because we already have a very integrated North American manufacturing platform. And trying to have 3 agreements, and why do I say 3 agreements instead of 1, might not be the most efficient and smartest solution. Because it would be 1 agreement between the US and Canada, other between the US and Mexico, and a 3rd agreement between Canada and Mexico. And having to reconcile those frameworks, it would be very impractical. Jaime knows this much better than I. In the very beginning, NAFTA was not a trilateral deal. But after some thought, common sense made it a trilateral deal. And this was 25 years ago, where the integration of the value chains was not present. It was a projection. Today is a reality. So if 25 years ago, NAFTA made much more sense as a 3-country agreement, that is more the case now. And I just want to underscore the same thing that Chrystia said. Beyond NAFTA, we strongly believe in the multilateral framework, in the framework of rule-based trade for the whole world. We strongly support the WTO framework. It doesn't mean that it's perfect. Of course, it needs to constantly evolve to address the problems and the changes in technology and the economy around the world. But for a nation like Mexico, it's essential to have a framework of rules to do trade with the world and to protect investments and to provide economic certainty to decision makers. And that's what the multilateral framework is about. So we, just like Canada, are strong supporters of that framework.
Very good. We have 10 more minutes, so we'll have one more question and open for Q&A. The second question I would like to raise quickly, too, is this concept of fair trade. You know, my understanding of a fair trade is that everybody has the same rules and they comply with them. But if we start introducing concepts of measuring, and Minister Guajardo was saying it earlier, measuring fair trade with the results, it's a complicated thing because countries can commit themselves to set the rules. Now, the outcome, a trade deficit is an outcome, it's not a policy input. So to commit yourself with a policy outcome is something that nobody seriously recommends to anybody. So I wonder, what is your view on this? Because I understand that in the US, this idea, particularly in DC, is sort of getting there some important elements. And my fear is that it's very difficult to determine that because, first of all, the trade deficits of a country are explained by the lack of savings of a country rather than from a trade policy. So I'm wondering how you look at it in Canada and how the Minister Videgaray sees it.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I'm very glad, especially by the final point that you made in the question, Jaime, about savings rates. Ildefonso referred to the importance of looking at the current account. That is much more the Canadian approach. And I would say I was very happy to see the pink rectangle of the Financial Times here among the sponsors, alongside Canada's fantastic Scotiabank. Thank you for being here, Brian. I worked for the Financial Times for many years, and Martin Wolf, who is the chief economics commentator, has been writing some very good pieces exactly about this point of how to look at trade. It's worth all of us reading them again. It's certainly more complicated and harder to put in a bumper sticker, but that is what actually drives a country's trade balance. And if you don't actually address the root cause, I doubt whether you will get the desired result. To the question of fair trade, look, I think something that is very important for all of the supporters of trade, and I very much count myself as one, and that is very much the Canadian position. It's very important for us to appreciate that in the United States, in Canada, I would say in the Western industrialized countries, there is a real issue with what you might call the hollowed out middle class. With middle class people who feel they have worked hard, they have played by the rules, but they are not getting a benefit from the 21st century economy. That's real. As it happens, our government, our party, very much campaigned on a middle-class jobs and growth agenda in 2015 at a time when, people in Canada were saying that's not an issue. It's not a problem. But it is really a problem for people. And it's important for us not to gloss over that or ignore it. Having said that, I think the root of the problem when it comes to this middle-class jobs issue, certainly from the Canadian standpoint, it is not a problem caused by trade. It's a problem caused by the transformation of the 21st century economy more generally, and very specifically by the technology revolution. And this is a really difficult problem because who wants to stop the technology revolution? It's interesting when you look at politics today, there are no Luddites out there. People maybe go to the public square and protest against trade, but I don't see people going there and smashing their iPhones or their Blackberries. We all embrace the technology revolution and the impact it has on our lives. I think a difficulty for all of us who are champions of the global economy and of trade is that trade makes an easy target for those anxieties. It's hard to say, it's because of the technology revolution, and the technology revolution is actually good, so we need to develop some public policy responses that share the benefits of that economic growth more widely. And certainly in Canada, one of the public policy responses that our government has championed is increasing taxes on the 1%. Brian pays higher taxes today than he did before we formed government. And I hope he feels it's a fair exchange, because by doing that, by saying to Canadians, you're going to have a fair deal inside your country, we're going to share the benefits broadly inside the country, our government will be able to also champion trading opportunities for great Canadian global champions like Scotiabank. So that's how we are working to answer this political challenge. But it's hard. It's always going to be it's always easier politically to blame foreigners than it is to say it's really complicated and we need to embrace the technology revolution even as we work very, very hard to be sure that the fruits of that economic transformation are shared widely in our country.
It's very clear that throughout the world there's a lot of frustration, particularly on the middle classes, about the lack of opportunity. And it's easy to scapegoat trade, and particularly to point to trade deficits as a problem. Certainly, I don't buy into that measurement. I'm trained as an economist. I've learned to believe in the theory of comparative advantage and specialization, and also to understand that trade flows are a fraction of something larger called the balance of payments, which includes capital flows and other flows, which are a complex dynamic that might not be explained just by simplistic trade rules. But beyond that, when we talk about the concept of fair trade or unfair trade, I think that's a seductive word that can be used in really bad ways. And to me, trade that is unfair is trade that is violating the rules or is going against the principles of a market economy. So if you're trading with a partner that is willing to subsidize, say, its steel industry, and have huge overcapacity and systematically dumping and hurting producers, well, that's unfair. But under the current framework of free trade, we already have the tools to go after that. So perhaps we're not doing such a good job in terms of enforcement. I don't think that there's a need to revise the concept of free trade, but we need to have a better understanding of what should be improved. What are the things that we've learned over the past years about what can be done better in trade? And just a quick word on workers. President Peña Nieto, at the beginning of the year, set 10 goals, 10 specific objectives for our negotiations and talks with North America. One of them is to improve the well-being and the earnings of workers. That's got to be a goal. But are we going to achieve that through protectionism, restraining exports and imports? Or can we promote that through more trade, more integration, and more value creation, and particularly more productivity? We think that's the answer, and that's going to be a guiding principle as Ildefonso and the team engage on NAFTA talks with our friends in Canada and the US.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much. I think we have time for 2 questions from the public. 2 questions from the public. Too many microphones here, maybe too few there. 2 questions. If you want to ask them in English, perfect. If you want to do it in Spanish, I'll make a quick translation. So make sure that your question is quick. Diana Negroponte.
Diana Negroponte from the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars and a great supporter of Mexico. Minister Videgaray, you have just raised one word which is key, and Minister Freeland, you alluded to it, and that's the word training. Education was only raised by Brian Porter, the president of Scotiabank, and yet it is critical. If we are to avoid the pressure from protectionism and inward looking, we need education for our workforce, for our citizens. And is there a way within the NAFTA modernization to include a chapter or articles which stress the need of the 3 governments to invest in the retraining, the education of our respective workforces?
Thank you, Diana. It's good to see you. I think training and retraining is essential in a time when technology is completely disrupting the way that resources. Governments in enhancing training opportunities and creating retraining opportunities, I think is more important now than what it was just a few years ago. Should that be a part of the NAFTA agreement? It might. It can make sense to make that part of a new NAFTA agreement. But I think what is most important, it's got to be at the core of our public policies in the 3 countries, certainly in Mexico. We need to make things like dual education, continued education, part of our essential parts of our education system, and not just think like it was possible 30 years ago to think that people will be educated in the early years of their life and then have successful careers. That won't be the case anymore, and certainly that will only accelerate. So it's got to be part of our own. It's got to be part of our own priorities in public policy. And maybe it can be part NAFTA can provide a framework for that, particularly for cooperation and having more Canadians study in Mexico and the US and more Mexicans in Canada and the US. That can be an interesting component of that, but I think most of all, it's got to be a national priority.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and definitely something worth us thinking about. It's certainly, you know, as Luis says, it's also really a question of national priorities. It's something Canada is very focused on, and it's an area that this US administration is very focused on. I've had a lot of conversations with the White House specifically about that area. They're very interested in working on apprenticeships. I've shared with them what we do at some Canadian universities, led by the University of Waterloo, which has a very effective co-op program where students begin working in business while they're pursuing their degrees. And that has been very effective both at improving the quality of their education, but also crucially, they can get jobs as soon as they graduate. Something that we can include in NAFTA. Thanks for the idea.
So we have time for one more quick question.
Good morning, Victor Rodriguez. Ministers, do you think that the electoral times in the United States and Mexico will play a big role, and the United States may try to delay the negotiation until they have the midterm elections to avoid having a political impact, and that may impact also in Mexico, considering the presidential election of next year?
We've said it all along, and we've been very public about it. Elections make it much more harder to have a negotiation on anything, including trade. So I think in the interest of providing certainty and clarity about the rules of the game of trade and investment protection in the North American region, it's better to have the negotiations rather soon. And that's where we are encouraged by the recent developments in the US, as Ildefonso explained, and now we have a time framework that is possible. I don't think that having the negotiations happening during an election cycle, it's the best environment to have a successful trade deal. And that would apply not only for Mexico, but for any other democracy in the world. So I think it's common sense that we try to do it as soon as possible. And it's important. Companies, investors, financial markets need certainty, and that's what this is about.
So just speaking for Canada, we are in a rather fortunate position because we don't have our next election until October 2019. So we have some runway. Luis obviously will have a better sense than I do about the politics in Mexico, but I think it's an important question because it highlights something that Ildefonso spoke about as well, which is all of us have domestic politics. We are all, I think, very aware of and focused on the domestic politics in the United States, but Mexico and Canada are democracies too. And we have domestic politics and domestic pressures and even domestic emotions. And those will be elements that come to play during the negotiations. And I think all three parties need to be aware of those forces which are at play for each of us.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, it's wonderful to see how rationality is the main component of the discussion we had today. It was a very rational discussion. One wonders if we could see that in other instances, but here is very, very encouraging. I think you should accompany to give them a round of applause after this wonderful presentation. Thank you.